This is David with 3 Orcs. Today we're talking to DM Mike on performing a Session 0 in Castles Crusades. This can be applied to ETT, so it's not specific to Fantasy Grounds, but it can also be used at the table. Hey, DM Mike, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Mike, I've been playing D&D since I was 15, so it's about too damn long before I give my own name away. And I just Crusades last year, and it's kind of taking me away from the mainstream games. That is just a quick introduction here.
I wanted to talk about Session 0. When we're looking for a player for a game, we want to make sure that we get the right kind of players to fit with the right group, so that way they mesh well and play well together. And also it sets the expectations of the campaign and how the Dungeon Master runs it. And that's why I wanted to talk to somebody first before they actually just join the campaign and create a character. We want to make sure that this is the kind of game that they're looking for and that they'll have fun playing. So that's why I always talk to somebody first before we actually perform character creation. Some of this information is just my opinion. It's how I run the game. This is how 3 Orcs games are presented to the new players, and I have a little speech and a whole thing, a topic that I'd like to cover and see what page the player's on. And I also want to find out what kind of player it is to make sure they fit in with the kind of campaign that I'm running. I noticed there's a few kinds of different players over the years since the 80s. There's the kind that are 5-foot grid battle map focused, where they focus on the miniatures or the tokens and the battle map, and they move their miniatures around, roll dice, and they use that for a lot of their explanation, description of what they're doing in the game. And that's the kind of game they like. And then there's another kind of player that likes to describe their actions and not focus so much on the battle map or the miniatures. And I think that depending on the kind of game you're running, you need to find the right players that will not only enjoy that play style, but will have a good time with others in that game and continue playing. So I would describe that kind of play where you're describing your actions as theater of the mind. Because the Dungeon Master will present the situation. He'll describe what you see, describe what's happening, and then the player in turn will just describe what he wants to do, and then the Dungeon Master will reply with a description of what happens. When you're focusing on a 5-foot grid, it's not as important. You don't have to talk as much because a lot of that stuff is self-evident in just looking at the miniatures or the tokens on the battle map. So, Mike, do you ever have any experience with that kind of thing?
Yeah, actually. My personally, I tend to have a hybrid of styles. It's very strange. Some people think of them as two completely different styles, even though they've played in both types of games.
I see that, yeah. I know it's not possible just to be able to play one way because of different situations that arise during the game. Sometimes the battle's too complicated and too big. Too much is going on. The room is too complicated. There's too many variables. The terrain, how many doors, corridors, how many creatures are in the battle, spell casting. So sometimes you do have to pull out some sort of miniature or token for representation to get everybody on track. That way there's no misunderstanding what's happening in that particular combat. And I agree, sometimes you have to pull all that out just to be able to run that combat or that encounter. But most of the time, it's not necessary, especially like guard rooms or wandering monsters or any kind of small encounters. You don't necessarily have to have a battle map to resolve that. And so there's different ways of playing, and I know there's different kind of players that like different kinds. So over the years, since the 80s, I noticed that there's a couple different kinds of groups of players, and their paths diverged starting at 3E. And I want to talk about performing Assassin Zero for Castles and Crusades, and why this conversation is so important. It's not just to discuss differences in game systems at all. The idea behind this conversation is to point out what is different about CNC and how we play the game. And that's why we're having this conversation. So, but you still have to have history. So we go back to the 80s, and there was more than just two kinds of players, but I'm just pointing that out for the sake of this conversation. So back then, there's the miniature type players and there's the role players. A lot of it had to do with maybe if they didn't have any money and they couldn't afford miniatures anyway, but they could still use dice or coins or popsicle sticks or whatever. So when first edition came out, it's really funny is I'm trying to figure out where to start with this. I want to talk about the versions of D&D, not because I want to compare them or to critique them, because the way Castles Crusade plays out, the rules it has, the mechanics, and the reasons behind it, and how it changes gameplay. So I think this needs to be discussed. So we're going to start with AD&D, but Gary Gygax is the Gygaxian world of his game mechanics and his world, the way he runs the game, and it has two pillars of gameplay, which is adventure and exploration. So the modules, you can see from the modules written back then, the B1, B2, T1, the Gs, that they're mostly exploration and very deadly, the way they were written, and they were not balanced. So you can walk into a room that's completely overbalanced and it could actually kill the party. Where in newer editions like 5th edition, they're perfectly balanced because of the whole CR, and it's expected for the Dungeon Master to balance these encounters out so the party has a good chance of overcoming that obstacle. And the way the game's designed, that's what is expected. It's not as deadly. They expect you to overcome so many obstacles in a game session, where in 1st edition they didn't really expect that. It's more about survival. And in AD&D, you were an upcoming hero, hoping to become a hero someday, and to do great things and save the realm. In newer editions of D&D, you're already pretty much a hero and very capable to be able to handle almost any situation, and it's very hard to lose or die. And that's the kind of game style that is, and a lot of players like that and they have fun playing. Where in old D&D, it's more about survival. And I can see why some people wouldn't like that, because some of the mechanics behind why it's so deadly is because of things like save or die. So if you get bit by a spider or a poisonous snake or a poisonous trap and you fail your save, you're dead. And I can see why people say that's not fair. That doesn't sound like fun. I don't want to play that. And also undead, same thing. They can drain your levels. They can turn you into undead. They can paralyze you. There's so many deadly things, for example, that undead can do that is less dangerous in newer editions of D&D. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I understand how deadly that is, and I understand the critique that maybe you think that's not fair or not fun, but if you played AD&D entirely, embraced the game as a balanced design, all the mechanics of it, like what the Dungeon Master Guide, the Gary Gygax stated in Dungeon Master Guide, it balances out in a different kind of way. So the way to mitigate all these problems is through character creation. So you start with character creation. You have to choose what race you are, what class you are, what abilities, what capabilities you have. You have to buy a certain equipment. The choice of equipment that you purchase, the way you roleplay your character, and not just you mitigate how hard this game is later by character creation, but also the balance of the party itself. If you group together with other classes that can actually help mitigate these, how hard it is later in the game, that helps the whole party as a whole. It becomes more manageable.
At least to me, pretty spot on in terms of the historical design. Another thing to consider too is that the older editions of the game, you have your the newer edition, 5th edition and 4th edition, even back to 3rd, your characters were heroic and exceptional right out of the gate. And in the older editions, they made you work for it a little bit. So there was no, there wasn't this idea that you were just going to go out and be amazing. It was very much a zero to hero type deal. Something else to consider, though, especially when you look at games like third edition D&D, Pathfinder, fourth and fifth edition, pretty much everything after that point, and to some degree even advanced Dungeons and Dragons, as characters were also much simpler. I mean, you look at the old BECME or the basic expert guides, and you roll 3d6 down the line, pick your class, get some equipment, and go. There really isn't a whole lot there to sift through 300 feats, powers, and abilities. I don't even think you got to choose your own spells back in basic and expert.
Yeah, I agree. So part of the way to mitigate how hard the game is, to balance the game, to be fair, to be able to overcome these obstacles in AD&D, is also equipment that you buy, and how you role play your character, how you present yourself to the world. So the reason I bring this up is not to compare the two systems. I'm leading up to what CNC is and how that gameplay is. So the gameplay of CNC is also very deadly, or can be, and it also encompasses the same kind of gameplay that older editions do. So we know that the game's deadly. We know it's not supposed to be balanced. There's two, in my viewpoint, there's two kinds of players in the game, starting from the 80s. They focus on the grid and the tokens, and they move them, and then they give limited descriptions of what they're doing. And the focus of the game is generally on that. And newer games, systems, starting with 3.0 and up, the mechanics of the game are focused on that 5-foot grid, and it's really hard to get away from that because the way the feats work and the skills work. Where in old AD&D there was no skill system. So a skill system was based on role playing. You role played what you're going to do, you describe what you're going to do, and the Dungeon Master describes what happens or the reaction. The other style of gaming that I noticed over the years is more of descriptive role playing. You'd call that theater of the mind. So the player would describe what he's doing, and the Dungeon Master would respond with a description of the reaction of what happens. And I see a case for both of those, because yes, I believe in both, because sometimes the encounter is so big, it's got such a complicated room with a lot of objects in it and a lot of monsters and spell casting going on, that sometimes you do have to break out the miniatures. You still have to bring out the tokens and see where everybody's on that map. But most encounters are small, like guard rooms or wandering monsters. So usually when I run my game, I use both, depending on the situation. But most of the time, I use Theater of the Mind. So when I perform a session 0, I first ask what experience the player has before joining my game. I want to see what kind of play style that he enjoys. Some players, they just strictly like to focus on that battle map. They don't like to describe and say too much. They let their actions speak for them. They move their miniatures around, and that's what they love. They really like that. They like creating characters and doing all the math and number crunching. Then other players, they like to really get into their character and talk a lot. They like to role play, describe their actions a lot. So I usually let somebody, when they first join me, to describe what kind of gaming they enjoy before joining my game. And then I'll decide whether or not they'll fit in with the group that I'm running. So, you want to comment on that, Mike?
So you're definitely right about the people who prefer miniatures versus theater of the mind play. And I've played games on both sides of things, games that are almost exclusively miniature based and games that are theater of the mind, and then a mix of both. I did find, especially for miniatures, I used everything from pieces of set that I had to actual expensive miniatures that I made myself, and it's all really it's all like you said, there are encounters entirely too big. Although you have one part role in the part that is almost never used, and that is a cartographer, somebody who's going to sit there, do the rhythm on, and out to explored. It's always fun to compare the map the players come up with versus what you have on the screen.
Yeah, okay, I get that. Well, I didn't want this to be a conversation, just comparing the different editions of the game, but I do bring the subject up for two reasons. One, to find out what kind of player they are and see if they'll fit in with the group that I'm running. And a second reason is to lead up to what CNC is. So we'll get to that now. If I see that they master my play style, which is mostly theater of the mind, and they're not too heavily focused on the 5-foot grid, then I'll move on to what CNC is, which is basically it's a modern version of AD&D. That's how I describe it. Basically, it was published in 2004 by Trollord Games. The official description, the official statement is that Castles and Crusades, the fantasy role playing game, was published by Trollord Games in 2004. From what I know, Gary and the Chalt brothers got together back in 2000, and they decided to create a newer edition of AD&D. So I just want to point out one thing: is first and second edition was called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons (AD&D). So when Gary left the company, and they started focusing on they started focusing on the third edition. They renamed the product to Dungeons and Dragons 3.0. It was no longer called AD&D, and it went in a different direction. And in my belief, from what I've heard, if Gary was still with TSR at the time when they were creating third edition, it would be more like this game, Castles and Crusades. It probably would not went in many of the directions that they chose to go in third edition, because Gary was against a lot of that kind of stuff. So third edition came out. I see why they did it. They focused on giving the agency and the rules to the players, and not less to the DM. They made it so it's easier to learn just from reading the books, which was a big problem in the day. When Gary wrote the first books, he called it the Dungeon Master Guide, the player's handbook, because he didn't really imagine. He didn't consider that anybody would even buy these books unless they already knew how to play D&D. They assumed that nobody would buy it unless they already knew how to play. So a lot of us on the West Coast bought those books and tried to learn how to play the game. It was a little confusing trying to figure it out with nobody showing us. And they knew that was a problem, and they resolved a lot of that in second edition and even more in third edition. So I get all that stuff. So if Gary was still with the company, he would have went in a little bit more different direction, more towards what this game is, which is Castles and Crusades, which is really an advanced version, like third edition of AD&D, not D&D third edition. So if you see where I'm coming from with that, it's basically 90% the same game. You can pick up the player's handbook, and it's all the chapters are in the same spot, all pretty much the same spells, the equipment, the character classes and races. It's just a modern version of a more up-to-date modern version, a sensibility of what gaming should be, what it is these days. Like everything's ascending. You have to roll this number or higher. Where in old AD&D, some of it was you have to roll low, sometimes you have to roll high, and you have THAC0. It's kind of confusing and all over the place. So it's more modernized in that regard. What's interesting is I know they went through all the spells, and they combed the rules. They after 40 years of experience, they went over every rule, all the combat, every spell, the equipment, classes, races, and they updated it in his opinion and the Chenault brothers' opinion what it should be. So it's more up to date of those rules, and it's more streamlined. So it's a faster playing game, which is great. That's what everybody would want. And also, it cleaned up some of the text and some of the confusing aspects of the first edition to make it more sense. So the thing is another thing that he was kind of against was no skills, and that's what I'm trying to lead up to. This whole conversation is about skills. So the rule mechanics are based on more like some AD&D with some third edition stuff in it, like forward, higher, ascending numbers, but without skills. So this is how skills work. Skills are based on role playing. And to do that, there's 5 things I look at when somebody wants to perform something with skills. One is your race, and then your class, and then the equipment that you have, how you role play, how you present yourself to the world, what you look like, the things you say, and then last but not least is your background, your history. What did you do, or how were you raised growing up with your parents, or on the streets of a city, or in the forest? So with all those factors in mind, determines whether or not you have any kind of certain skill of how to ride a horse, how to read, if you can swim, things like that. So if a player says, I want to swim across this river, I'll take all that in mind. The equipment they have, the armor they're wearing, the clothes they're wearing, their background. Maybe that player was raised on a boat by his father, a fisherman's boat, helping him fish every day his whole life growing up. Well, obviously he knows how to swim then, right? But what if this person, before became an adventurer, was raised on the streets as an orphan? There's no way he knows how to ride a horse unless there's something special in his background that says that he had experience riding horses, maybe because in his background he groomed horses at the stables. So it's all based on somebody's background. You create a background that would make sense, that's interesting for the character, and then that will determine what kind of skills you might have beyond adventuring or your class skills. And the mechanics of performing those is all based on your stats. So if you want to move a boulder, that's a strength check. If you want to dodge or walk across that tightrope, that's a dexterity check. If you want to talk your way or bluff your way past the guard, that's a charisma check. And they're all modified by the way you present yourself, the way you role play the situation, and any maybe equipment that you have, how you look, all these factors, including race and class. And then we go from there. And you can interact with the scene to actually raise or lower the chances of success as well. So instead of having a skill list for Castles and Crusades, you can pretty much try to do anything you want, and then how well you're good at it is determined by all these things I listed. And you can also develop your character along those lines too. Come up with plausible stories of your background and your personality to make you be better at something. Or like you can create a fighter, yes, and you think that's boring, but actually no. Maybe you're a pirate, or maybe you're a brigand, or maybe you're a guard. There's a lot of different kind of fighters. So what the clothes you wear, how you look, how you present yourself, how you talk to other people, can all directly affect chances of success of things you try to do in the game. And that's how I run this game. It's all based on the siege engine, which is basically all your saving throws and all your skill checks are based on the stats. You get a strength check, dexterity check, charisma check. So Mike, what do you think about all that?
Yeah. When they created the game, they were very adamant, and I mentioned it several times in even the core rule books, that in CNC or your class, your skill set, as it's not defining who you are or need another skill set tacked onto it. But like you said, I would be a pirate. He could be an engineer. He could be a mercenary. All kinds of things. But at the end of the day, his skill set is he hits things with a piece of steel. But yeah,
yeah, you're right on. That's exactly how I present the game. Okay, so we talked about. Okay, the topic of this video is Session 0. So during Session 0, when I talk to a new player, I discuss all this with them to get them excited to play a role-playing game with more theater of the mind gameplay. And so I describe to them everything we just talked about, how the skill system works, and ideas of how you can use that in the game to get their creative juice running, and to think outside the box, to be able to role play the game more than actual in the box canned rule sets and feats that you would see in other systems. And and I like to point out how versatile it is to be able to role play your character beyond than thinking he's just a simple fighter. So I discuss this with the player. And this is all before character creation. I just want to go over the idea what this game is and how important how important this game tackles the concept of skills, which I think is the biggest difference in the game from other games, really. Because basically the rest of this game, in combat and races and classes and equipment and spells, is pretty much the same. It's just streamlined, so it plays faster. And then, of course, there's a last thing. The last little change about the Siege engine, which I usually don't bring up right away, because it's all about primes and not primes, which is a different mechanic than AD&D. It's the one big main difference in the game between old edition and new is the prime. You have to choose which stats of yours is a prime or not a prime, and that helps determine what you need to roll. So when you perform an ability check or a savings throw, your prime determines what you need to roll or not, instead of that chart on the Dungeon Master guide. The Dungeon Master shield back in AD&D first and second edition, it was covered with charts, and you have to cross-reference a chart to find out what to hit or what the savings throw is. So this Siege engine replaces those charts, so it makes the game streamlined and makes it play faster. It's really quick and simple to find out what that number needs to be versus trying to reference this stuff on the chart on the back of the DM shield. That's the only real major difference between the games, is that, and some other little modifications, little adjustments that Gary and the Shaw brothers thought would make more sense versus the first go around. Like they changed charge a little bit. They changed dual wielding is now -3 and -6 versus -2 and -5. They thought it'd probably be better that way. With they're rule designers, they're game designers. I'm not, so I'm not going to question their decisions on changing some of these rules versus first edition. But I figured after 40 years of experience of his own game, he probably had a good reason to change it to that. There's a little bit of modifications like that, but not much. Just very little slight adjustments they thought probably made more sense. Like, you can only fire 1 arrow per round. Remember, in old D&D it was 2 arrows per round. And I saw this personally. I remember running second edition, and they took my dragon in the 3rd melee round, dead. And these guys were all like maybe 3rd level. I was stunned. They totally ruined my campaign. They took that dragon down. That rule too, if he gets below half hit points, the dragon drops. And he was already like 200 feet in the air. I was so upset. It ruined my game. And it was mostly because those arrows, they got between 3 of them, they like over a half a dozen, maybe a dozen arrows in the air before that thing finally came down. That was bad. And I realized how overpowered bows were back then even. So I'm glad that not only is it C&C, but all modern games, I believe, is now only 1 arrow per turn. So that's huge.
Or per action. They in AD&D they had a lot of like 3 attacks over 2 rounds to keep track of as well.
Well, this game does too. It's a little bit different, but it does have that. Each class does have skills, abilities they call it, like multiple attacks, favored weapon, favored enemy. All this typical stuff you're used to, and they changed the character classes just a little bit, where rangers don't have spells. But the thing is this the CKGuide, the Dungeon Master Guide, they call it the CKGuide, has all this stuff in it as optional rules. So if you want to have your ranger that does have spell ability that's not in the player's handbook, you can give it to him. Just use the CKGuide. For some reason, there's a whole movement back then that they thought Rangers with spellcasting was stupid or something. I don't know. I don't know what the argument was, but for some reason this game, they decided that wasn't a good idea, so they stuck with it. But if you really want your Rangers to have spell abilities, you can either dual class them or just use the optional rules in the CKGuide. The players never see these rules, these optional rules, which is good, really good. I hate players' handbooks that have optional rules in them, because then that makes the players think it's a rule and they're going to use it in the game. And that's the problem with 5th edition, in my view, because there's too many sections in the player's handbook that they include the optional rule. So now the players automatically, for some reason, players don't see the word optional. They don't know what that word means. They just think it's in a rule book and it's a rule, they're going to use it. What do you think about that, Mike?
Yeah, I remember when 5th edition first came out, it was feats were optional, backgrounds were optional, all that stuff was considered optional by the game master. And you look at the state of the game today, and it's just if you get into a 5th edition D&D game, you can just kind of assume that there are going to be backgrounds and feats and pretty much everything that is presented in the player's handbook, and probably more.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
I don't mind the optional rules. I just don't want them in the player's handbook. I like to start off a new group with all the base rules, especially if they're new to the game or new to like fantasy grounds or something. That way they can learn it. And then maybe if we do this again with the same players, I'll start adding more rules to get it more interesting. Maybe add some more classes from another book or something. That's how I like to do it. I like to keep things simple at first until people get it down.
Yeah, and that's a good idea. I remember for a while, I would not. There were certain classes that I would not let new players pick, and the reason was they were just too complicated. And every time I had allowed a player who was new to the system pick that class, usually it was one of the more advanced classes or a dedicated spellcaster of some kind. They either get overwhelmed with all the choices, or everyone's waiting for 20 minutes while they try to figure out their spells when the game starts.
It's like a new player playing a wizard for the first time. That's the worst. Wizards are pretty complicated.
But yeah, and oh, by the way, those classes you mentioned, actually, I believe they're in the Adventurer's Backpack. For the Ranger variant and the Bard Spellcaster variant and all that. Because I do believe and on a related note, I do believe the original Ranger was based on Aragorn from Lord of the Rings as a sort of archetypical template that they used. Well, between Aragorn and Legolas, since they depending on whether or not you're looking at archers or I don't know where the dual wielding came from, but yeah, as far as spell casting, I mean, I never really I always thought it was a bit of a hindrance to the game that it would just assume that a ranger was a spellcaster.
Yeah, I heard that. I remember that now. There might have been a Dragon magazine article on that back in the 80s. I have the magazines, I just need to read them again. Please subscribe down below if you want to see more videos like this. And I'll go ahead and make more for not only Castles and Crusades, but other rule systems too. I want to bring up the point that the reason we made this video too. So let me review real quick. That we have a session 0 not only to kind of tell people how this game works because they're new to CNC, but also to find out what kind of player they are to make sure they fit in with the group. So that's why I had that conversation first. So we have a conversation about, first I asked them, what kind of game do you like to run? In your experience, what kind of D&D that you like playing in the past, and what do you prefer? So I get that out of the person first. I want to find out what kind of player they are. Then after that, I'll bring up some of my viewpoints of what AD&D was originally and how it compares to newer D&D. So I want to point out what page I'm on, my beliefs in the system. And then from there, I like to point out where CNC came from, how it grew into the game system it is based on history in the past and how different it is compared to the newer versions of D&D. So I point that out. Then I start talking about the skill system. First, I point out that the game is pretty much really close to AD&D. Then I point out the game system, the skill system, and go over that to get them excited to want to be able to role play in the game. Because a lot of people come from newer game systems that they're getting frustrated with it. They want to try something different. They've heard about how these faster OSR style kind of games are more fun to play because they're light and fast, and they give you more leeway if your creativity when you roleplay your character. And I wanted to point out why that's so during my session 0, because that really needs to be discussed before they make their character anyway. So when it comes to mitigation of how tough the game is, they have to think about what they want to play. They have to think about what they want to play versus other players in the group. And then they have to think about ways they're going to play their character based on the equipment they buy, the weapons and armor, the gods they worship, how they present themselves. Do they want to be like a certain kind of person? Like you could get a thief in the party And he could present himself to be just a merchant. Nobody knows he's a thief. He's dressed like a merchant. He acts like a merchant. He talks to people like he's a normal guy. Nobody knows he's a rogue. You could do that if you wanted to. And it's just role playing. And it's also the equipment that you own and how you present yourself, the clothes you're wearing. So all that stuff has a direct effect on the results of the game. That's why I really wanted to point out what's so different about CNC and any other game is how you present yourself and how you role play has a direct bearance on it affects the game directly. And that's why I wanted to point out in this game versus others why it's so important. Because if you try to play this game like any other D&D game out there, nothing's really going to shine about it. All it is a rule book with different kind of rules, some rules that are a little different. Why are you even playing this game then? You might as well just play another one. It doesn't matter. You want to play this game for what it is, what makes it so good, and that's where it shines. Is to be able to role play your character, to be able to pull off some impossible feats, creative things that you can do in this game that other games pretty much limit you or hard to pull off in other games because it's so focused on the rules and the skills and the feats and the classes that it's hard to think outside the box beyond what's on your character sheet. Where this game embraces it. It expects you to do it. You're actually the core mechanics of this game is dependent upon how you roleplay the situation, how you tackle it, and that's exactly how it works. Did you have Mike? Did you want to comment on that little thing right there?
Yeah. So I mean, the whole thing about session 0, ultimately, if there is any takeaway, which I think we discussed a little bit throughout here, is, I mean, it's about expectations. What do you, as just talking about, because even if it's somebody you already play with and you already went through that interview process and brought them on board, I mean, with my groups, I'll take them and we'll have a session 0. May or may not include character creation depending on if we want to do that. But for the most part, it's just talking about, and I had to recently sit my group down and do this again mid-campaign because apparently some things were unclear about whether the characters were supposed to be heroes or if we were doing a 0 to hero type campaign. But it was over a character's death, and it's really just getting everyone on the same page, sitting them down, be like, hey, are we doing theater of the mind? Or are we doing more battle mats? Are we this is something I'd like to see in the campaign, or as the GM, like, this is the sort of campaign I was planning on running, and all that stuff needs to get hashed out before session 1, really. Otherwise, you run into things like you might have a player show up playing CNC, for example, who is a little bit ticked off that you killed their first level character because they didn't know that a spider could had a poison that was save or die. So that's just my interpretation of everything we've discussed and session 0 and all that.
Yeah, I agree. Expectations is basically what it's all about. And the reason I go into such detail about CNC, especially the skills part, is to showcase how important I treat it in my game. So that way the player is prepared to describe everything he does and expect great results from it. The more effort he puts into it, the better the results will be. It directly affects the game. And I wanted to point that out. I wanted to point that out not only to get them on the same page to set their expectation that that's how we're going to run it, but I also want to get them excited. The reason I bring that up, go, oh, really? We can do all that? And I give them some examples. How they can pull off some stunts that they... it's not just a roll. You don't say, I search the room, and then you roll. It doesn't work that way. It's how you search the room. Not just how you describe it, but maybe the equipment you're using to do it, or maybe some of your inherent racial abilities or your class skills in combination of your role-playing. You can affect a bandit surrendering to you, even though not one bandit took any damage yet. It's possible. It really is. You can walk up to a guard and say, let me pass, and you can hold a fake note in your hand. Like an official note, and you just role play it the way you present yourself and act like you belong there. That can directly affect their chances of success. And another thing about this game is something about how we determine success. So I wanted to bring that up too before character creation. And that's it's a saying that in the player's handbook it states you shouldn't the dungeon master should not call for a roll unless there's a significant chance of failure. That's a rule. So don't create an attribute check or an ability roll unless there's a significant chance of failure. And that's important. So if you role play your way through a situation and you do such a good job at it, you really shouldn't have to roll. This is not a game of constant rolling. You should be able to role play your way through most things. And there's also a little side thing that some people mention. It's not an official rule. The Trollord guys don't say this or anything, but a lot of people do say this. They said basically, if the dungeon master actually calls out for you to make a roll, you pretty much lost already. You did not do good. You did not tackle the situation very well. You got to the point. You got to remember the rule. If you don't make a roll unless there's a significant chance of failure. So if the dungeon master is asking you to make that roll, there's a significant chance of failure. That means you didn't do a good enough job to role play your way out of that situation. You probably missed something somewhere, and it could have started way back, how you talk to somebody else, or the clothes that you're wearing, or how you walk through that door, and everything directly affects everything. And I like to bring that up because that right there is one of the biggest differences between C&C and other games. That's why I like to point that out before we start making characters. I got some great responses from you.
Thanks. Like I said earlier, I wasn't really expecting to shoot video today, but it was a good conversation.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap this up. This was a video of not only just explanation of what Session 0 is, but it's a Session 0 for C&C, and it's a little bit about what C&C is altogether. This is my spiel I usually make to new players that join my game, because I think it's all important before they make a character. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, DM Mike, for your input. It's very valuable. I really appreciate your help on this.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
All right, thanks. And if you have any comments, please leave a comment down below, or any suggestions you might like to see more videos of. And thank you so much for your time. See ya.